The scent of old ashes and freezing rain clung heavy to the high stone walls. Her family had held the name Silverthorn since the first stone of the Winterbourne keep was laid. Today, the Alpha was signing a decree to give that ancestral legacy to his favorite mistress. He wanted to make the outsider a noble. He wanted to make his fated mate a nobody. The high hall of the Winterbourne keep was not built for comfort or warmth. It was a cavernous, oppressive space constructed entirely of unpolished grey stone and heavy, wrought iron. The architecture was designed specifically to humble anyone who stood before the raised dais. High above, narrow slit windows let in the meagre, pale light of the winter afternoon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the uneven flagstones. The air inside the room was perpetually freezing, smelling faintly of old wood smoke, damp earth, and the metallic tang of ancient, dried blood. Today, the grand hall was suffocatingly full, packed shoulder to shoulder with the elite members of the hierarchy. Yet, despite the massive crowd, it was utterly, terrifyingly silent. The collective breathing of 100 wolves formed a low, continuous drone that vibrated against the cold stone floor. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. In the dead center of the room sat a massive table, carved from a single slab of petrified oak. Upon its scarred, blackened surface lay the decree of erasure. It was a heavy, yellowed parchment, its edges stiff and brittle with age. The document was a legal and spiritual death warrant. It was the magical instrument by which 1,000 years of sacred lineage would be severed, stolen, and handed over to an outsider who possessed no ancestral claim to the magic of the land. The inkwell beside it was wrought from cold iron, shaped like a snarling wolf, waiting to drink her ruin. Alpha Caelanvain occupied the high-backed throne at the head of the timber table. He wore the heavy, black fur mantle of his station draped over his broad shoulders, a physical manifestation of his absolute authority over the territory. His storm-grey eyes were hard, fixed straight ahead with a chilling, arrogant resolve. He looked powerful, he looked untouchable. He also looked entirely blind to the catastrophic magnitude of the act he was about to commit. He believed he was merely altering a political title to appease his desires. He did not understand that he was tampering with the fundamental, biological foundations of the realm. A king in his own mind, playing games with forces older than his bloodline. Standing intimately close at his right side was Sienna Lockhart, the favorite mistress, the ambitious usurper. She was draped in a sweeping gown of midnight blue silk, a fabric so delicate and obscenely expensive it had likely cost more than the winter rations of 3 border villages combined. Her slender fingers rested possessively on the Alpha's broad shoulder, her nails painted a sharp, predatory crimson. Her scent was an overwhelming, cloying mixture of crushed jasmine and poisoned honey, completely overpowering the natural clean aroma of pine that usually dominated the keep. She was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, before it cut you to the bone. Her chin was tipped upward in a posture of supreme, unearned victory. She was already practicing her new nobility. 15 paces away, completely isolated in the center of the cold stone floor, stood Lyra Silverthorn. She wore a simple, austere dress of grey-spun wool. No jewels adorned her neck. No silver crown rested on her dark hair. She carried no weapons. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. Everyone in the crowded hall expected her to shatter. The assembled wolves watched her with bated breath, desperately waiting for the inevitable emotional collapse. They expected her to fall to her freezing knees. They expected hot tears, frantic begging, the pitiful, desperate pleading of a discarded mate, clinging to the scraps of her former life. Lyra did not beg. She did not weep. She anchored her heavy leather boots to the freezing stone and kept her sposon as straight as a rod of forged steel. Her internal wolf did not pace, did not whine, and did not thrash against the confines of her mind. Instead, the ancient beast sat perfectly still in the dark, watching the proceedings with cold, unblinking golden eyes. Lyra was very good at being unseen, at pulling her presence back until she was nothing but a quiet shadow in the margins of their loud, arrogant lives. Today, she used that absolute, terrifying stillness as a heavy shield against their mockery. Every muscle in her body was locked down, rendering her a statue carved from winter ice. At the head of the table, Kaelin reached for the ceremonial silver dagger. The metal glinted maliciously in the pale light filtering from above. Without a single flinch of hesitation, he sliced the pad of his right thumb. The sharp, visceral scent of raw alpha blood immediately flooded the room. It was a heavy metallic odor that demanded instinctual submission from every shifter present. Kaelin pressed his bleeding digit firmly to the bottom of the banishment parchment. The blood seal bloomed onto the porous parchment, a dark, ugly flower of stolen authority setting permanently into the ancient fibers. The deed was solidified in blood. "It is done," Kaelin declared. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated aggressively through the floorboards and rattled the iron sconces on the walls. "By my blood, and by the sovereign right of the Alpha, the old ties are severed. Sienna is now recognized by the ancestral laws of this pack as a noble of the highest order. She bears the name Silverthorn. The lineage is hers." A collective breath rushed out of the gathered pack. Several of the minor lords nodded in swift, eager agreement, their eyes darting toward the new noble mistress, their minds already calculating exactly how to curry her political favor. The sycophants were already bending the knee in their hearts. Sienna smiled. It was a soft, cruel expression that did not even begin to reach her eyes. She leaned down, pressing her smooth cheek briefly against the Alpha's temple before looking across the table at the woman she was actively replacing. "The release, parchment, Kaelin," the mistress murmured. Her voice dripped with an artificial saccharine sympathy that made the air feel thick and putrid. "She must sign the release parchment. It is the law. We must ensure there is no confusion among the elders regarding her departure from the keep." Kaelin's jaw tightened. A flash of irritation crossed his handsome features. He hated being reminded of procedure, but he reached out with his uninjured hand and slid a secondary, much starker document across the polished oak. This was the final, mundane legal contract, the paperwork of absolute banishment. "Step forward, Lyra," he commanded. The heavy alpha frequency threaded deeply through his tone, instinctively attempting to force her biological compliance. "Sign the release." Lyra moved. As she took her first step forward, the ambient temperature in the cavernous hall seemed to instantly plummet 10 degrees. Spidery patterns of ice began to form on the edges of the high, narrow windows, creeping silently across the glass. She walked with a slow, measured cadence, her boots echoing rhythmically against the stone. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. She reached the heavy timber table and stopped. She did not look at the Alpha. She did not look at the gloating mistress. She looked only at the parchment. Her fingers wrapped around the thick barrel of the iron-wrought quill. The metal was freezing to the touch, biting harshly into her skin. But she did not let her hand tremble. Not even a microscopic fraction. She dipped the heavy nib into the well of black ink. It pooled for a microsecond before she pressed it to the paper. The scratching sound of the metal tip against the rough parchment was agonizingly loud in the dead silence of the hall. It was a harsh, grating noise that finalized the erasure of her entire identity. She wrote her name for the very last time under his roof. Lyra laid the quill down softly. She stepped back, placing her hands calmly at her sides. Kaelin stared at her, his stormy gaze narrowing as a muscle feathered wildly in his jaw. He was furious. He wanted her overwhelming grief to validate his choice. He wanted her to scream, to fight, to give him a reason to feel righteous in his immense cruelty. Instead, she gave him nothing but an empty, glacial stare. She turned on her heel, her grey wool skirt sweeping over the cold stones, and walked away from the dais. The heavy oak door of her private chambers closed behind her with a dull, echoing thud. The sound effectively severed the loud, chaotic energy of the high hall from the suffocating, deadly quiet of her personal space. Lyra stood perfectly still in the center of the room for a long moment, simply letting her lungs process the freezing air. The hearth on the far wall had not been lit since yesterday morning. The grey stone blocks radiated a deep, bone-aching chill that seemed to seep directly through the thick soles of her boots. She did not move to strike a match or gather kindling. There was absolutely no point in warming a sanctuary she would never occupy again. She walked deliberately toward the massive cedar wardrobe that dominated the far corner of the room. She pulled the heavy wooden doors open. Inside hung rows of velvet gowns, delicate silk dresses, and heavy embroidered cloaks that Kaelin had purchased for her during the early, deceitful months of their mating. The fabrics were rich in deep reds, forest greens, and vibrant golds. She ignored all of them. They belonged to the Alpha's mate, a role that had just been legally assassinated downstairs. Instead, Lyra reached up to the highest shelf and pulled down a simple, worn leather rucksack. It was heavily scarred from years of hard use, smelling faintly of saddle soap and old dust. She placed it on the bare mattress and began to pack with ruthless, mechanical efficiency. She took only the absolute, undeniable necessities of survival. 2 thick, undyed wool tunics that had seen better days but offered supreme warmth. A pair of sturdy leather riding trousers, scuffed at the knees. Extra woolen socks, spun thick to ward off frostbite. A heavy winter cloak lined with rough, unbleached sheepskin that she had owned since she was a girl. A steel flint striker, a hunting knife with a wrapped leather hilt that rested perfectly in her palm, and a small, tightly sealed leather canteen. Every item was chosen for its utility. She was stepping into the wild, and the wild did not care for silk. When the survival gear was fully secured, she moved to the small, mirrored vanity near the frost-covered window. The polished wooden surface was completely bare, save for one single, solitary item resting perfectly in the center. It was a silver hairbrush. Lyra reached out, her fingers rasping carefully around the handle. It was a heavy, solid piece of metal, completely unlike the flimsy, gilded trinkets the mistress favored. The edges were deeply tarnished, darkened by decades of constant touch, but the back of the brush was intricately engraved with a large, sweeping crescent moon. It was the original crest, the true mark. Her mother's old silver hairbrush was a relic older than the keep itself. The metal felt freezing against her calloused palm, yet, as she gripped it tightly, it seemed to pulse with a faint, phantom warmth. It was a biological memory of a time when the bloodline commanded the respect of legendary kings, not the fleeting whims of petty, short-sighted alphas. She traced the tarnished crescent moon with the pad of her thumb. The faint, ghostly scent of dried lavender and old rain lingered stubbornly on the stiff bristles. She wrapped the brush carefully in a clean piece of white linen and placed it gently in the dead center of her rucksack, burying it deeply beneath the heavy wool. It was the only piece of her legacy she was taking. Everything else they could keep in their kingdom of ash. A sudden shadow eclipsed the thin, pale sliver of light spilling in from the stone corridor. Lyra did not flinch. She simply turned her head. Elder Brannock Vance stood in the open doorway. The old man leaned heavily on his intricately carved wooden staff, his knuckles stark white from the immense physical strain. His shoulders were stooped, bent entirely out of shape beneath the crushing weight of his own complicity. He refused to look her in the eye. He stared fixedly at the rough-hewn floorboards near the toes of her boots. The scent of him was unpleasant. It was a mixture of sour milk, old dust, and the sharp, undeniable reek of cowardice. "It is for the stability of the pack, Lyra," Brannock wheezed into the freezing silence. His voice was thin, reedy, and papery, sounding exactly like dry leaves scraping pointlessly across wet stone. The Alpha needs a strong, politically viable noble at his side. The western borders are restless. The rogues grow bolder every moon. Sienna's father commands 3 vassal packs and a small army of enforcers. You must understand the terrible burden of leadership. The ancient laws must sometimes bend to the harsh reality of survival. Lyra paused. Her hands gripped the thick leather straps of her rucksack. She looked quietly at the pack elder. This was a man who had sworn unbreakable, blood-bound oaths to her grandfather. This was a man who had held her as a squalling infant in the bitter winter snow and promised to protect the old ways until his dying breath. Now he was just a tired, frightened old man, standing in a doorway, desperately trying to justify political theft. She did not argue with him. She did not raise her voice to defend the sacredness of her bloodline. Arguing would imply that he still possessed the moral authority to validate her worth. He did not. Instead, Lyra hoisted the heavy leather pack onto her right shoulder. She adjusted the strap over her grey wool tunic and walked purposefully toward the door. Brannock shrank back against the wooden doorframe, instinctively making himself extremely small as she approached. He pulled his heavy, ceremonial robes tight against his frail chest to avoid brushing against her. Lyra walked past him without a single word. She did not spare him a second glance, leaving him entirely alone in the freezing, empty room with his pathetic excuses. The descent through the keep was a masterclass in sensory isolation. The ambient murmurs and low conversations of the pack ceased instantly wherever she stepped. Wolves parted before her like the sea, pressing their backs flat against the cold, damp stone walls to avoid making any form of eye contact. She could smell their deeply conflicting, chaotic emotions bleeding rapidly into the air, the sharp tang of pity, the heavy musk of guilt, the sour note of relief that it was not them, and the burning, acidic reek of collective shame. She ignored it all. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her storm-grey eyes focused strictly straight ahead. Her boots struck the spiraling stone steps with a rhythmic, measured cadence. Down, down, down. She walked past the grand, woven tapestries depicting her own forebears in glorious battle. The threaded faces of ancient Alpha Kings and Lunar Queens seemed to watch her in silent, tragic mourning as she passed. She walked past the intricate stone carvings of the crescent moon that Kaelan was now desperately trying to erase from their history. He could chisel away the stone, she thought distantly, but he could not chisel away the blood. She reached the ground floor. The massive, iron-bound double doors of the main entrance loomed ahead. The 2 heavily armed guards stationed at the threshold did not utter a single syllable as they stepped forward and hauled the heavy timber, locking bars back. The doors groaned on their massive iron hinges, swinging outward to reveal the harsh, biting, unforgiving landscape of the winter-born territory. The afternoon sun had already begun its descent, painting the distant, jagged mountain peaks in bruised shades of violet and grey. The freezing winter wind hit her face immediately. It felt like a physical blow against her cheeks, carrying the sharp, incredibly clean scent of frozen pine needles and vast stretches of undisturbed snow. It was a cleansing shock to her system, violently blowing away the cloying stench of the mistress's jasmine. She inhaled deeply, letting the frozen air sear her lungs and clear her mind of the toxic decay that had infected the keep. Lyra stepped over the threshold and walked down the long, sloping path toward the distant tree line. The snow crunched loudly beneath the thick soles of her boots. Each step took her further and further away from the political rot and the suffocating stone walls of the keep. The heavy sheepskin cloak provided minimal warmth against the biting chill, but it was enough to keep her core insulated. She walked for 2 miles down the winding mountain road, Her breath blew in small white clouds in the frigid air until she finally reached the pack boundary line. The sun was dipping below the horizon now, casting the world in a strange, silvery twilight. The border was marked by a series of ancient, waist-high weathered runestones, deeply buried in the frozen, unyielding earth. Frost clung to the runic carvings, obscuring the old warnings meant to keep enemies out. But Lyra was no enemy. She was the rightful heir, cast out by a blind fool. Crossing this physical line meant severing the residual magical hum of the pack bond. It meant officially becoming a rogue, an outcast entirely devoid of protection. It meant stepping into the vast, overwhelmingly dangerous unknown of the wild forest, where predators with teeth much sharper than Kaelin's lurked in the shadows. Lyra did not hesitate. Her stride did not break. She stepped directly over the invisible, magical threshold. A sudden, violent sting echoed deep within her chest. It was a final, sharp, physiological severing of the energetic ties that had bound her to Kaelin's territory since birth. The sacred thread woven between their souls, already stretched to the absolute breaking point by his public betrayal, finally snapped. It vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in her sternum that was almost immediately filled with a profound, terrifying rush of freedom. Her wolf whimpered once in the dark recesses of her mind, a brief acknowledgement of the severed mating bond, and then settled into a quiet, alert state of survival. The dense, dark canopy of the pine woods loomed directly ahead, forming a massive wall of silent, imposing shadow. The ancient trees stood like sentinels, their snow-laden branches weaving together to blot out the darkening sky. The whispering woods did not welcome strangers, but Lyra was not a stranger. The blood of the first Luna ran in her veins. She walked into the darkness of the ancient trees, pulling the heavy sheepskin cloak tightly around her shoulders to shield against the biting wind. She never once looked back. The whispering woods swallowed her whole. The deeper Lyra ventured into the ancient, untamed timberland, the more the oppressive, suffocating memories of the Winterborn Keep began to physically detach from her skin. The atmosphere here was entirely different. It lacked the harsh, metallic tang of dried blood and the cloying, putrid sweetness of Sienna's stolen nobility. Instead, the air was dense and heavy with the sharp, biting scent of frozen pine sap, crushed wintergreen, and the rich, loamy aroma of undisturbed earth sleeping beneath the snow. For the first 3 days, she simply walked. She moved with a slow, relentless mechanical rhythm, allowing the sheer physical exertion of trudging through deep snowdrifts to numb the lingering phantom pain in her chest. The violently severed mating bond had left a raw, hollow crater just beneath her sternum. It did not bleed outwardly, but it throbbed with a dull, persistent, agonizing ache. It was a biological reminder of a life that had been surgically excised by a blind fool. Yet, every time her heavy leather boots crunched against the fresh powder, taking her further from the political rot, the ache incrementally lessened. The freezing winter wind whipped fiercely against her cheeks, biting straight through the thick spun wool of her tunic, but she welcomed the pain. It was clean, it was honest. By the dawn of the 4th day, the dense, suffocating tree line finally broke. It gave way to a secluded, perfectly circular, snow-draped clearing. In the dead center of the glade stood the ancient standing stones. They were massive, monolithic pillars of dark, weathered granite, thrusting violently out of the frozen earth like the broken teeth of a forgotten god. Deep, jagged fissures ran down their sides, entirely choked with thick patches of dormant, silver moss, faint, intricate runic carvings. Vastly different from the crude, modern border markers of her former territory spiraled up the stone faces. The runes were nearly completely eroded by centuries of harsh winter winds, yet they still pulsed with a faint, buried luminescence when the pale daylight hit them. They were arranged in a wide, deliberate circle, creating a perfect ring of absolute, sacred stillness. As Lyra stepped over the perimeter of the clearing, the ambient temperature instantly shifted. The biting wind died down, deflected by an invisible ancient atmospheric barrier. A deep, resonant, heavy hum vibrated softly through the soles of her boots. The vibration traveled up her legs, settling deeply into the marrow of her bones. Normal shifters actively avoided these ruins, terrified by the heavy, suffocating pressure of the old magic. But her inner wolf did not cower. The majestic, silent beast inside her mind, which had remained perfectly still during her public humiliation, suddenly lifted its head. It let out a low, rumbling purr of absolute, instinctual contentment. The blood of the first Luna ran in her veins. The stones recognized their architect. Nestled precariously against the protective, towering lee of the largest monolith was an old, dilapidated forester's cabin. It was a humble, forgotten structure built from rough-hewn cedar logs and heavily chinked with hardened, frozen mud. The roof sagged dangerously under the weight of a decade of accumulated snowfall, and the single small window was nothing more than an empty, gaping square of blackness. It was a complete ruin. It was perfect. Lyra approached the structure with cautious, measured steps. She pushed the heavy, rotting wooden door open. The rusted iron hinges screamed in protest, a loud, grating, agonizing sound that violently shattered the profound silence of the glade. The interior smelled intensely of dry rot, abandoned animal nests, and profound, sweeping neglect. Dust motes danced lazily in the single, anemic shaft of pale winter light that managed to pierce the interior gloom. She did not waste a single second mourning the harshness of her new reality. The stoic survival instinct that had kept her spine straight in the high hall now drove her physical actions. She set her heavy leather rucksack down on the warped, uneven floorboards and immediately began the exhausting process of claiming the space. The domestic rituals of survival became her physical healing. She gathered thick, fragrant pine boughs from the surrounding woods, their needles sharp and sticky with frozen sap. She wove them tightly together, pressing the makeshift lattice against the broken window frame to block the freezing drafts. She cleared the stone hearth of years of accumulated, damp debris. Her hands grew raw and blistered, the skin tearing slightly against the rough, freezing stones. But she did not stop. She used her steel flint striker to ignite a small pile of dried birch bark. The process was agonizingly slow. Her fingers were numb, stiff with the biting cold, entirely lacking the dexterity required for easy survival. When the first tentative spark finally caught, landing perfectly on the fibrous bark and blooming into a fragile golden flame, she sat back on her heels. She simply watched it burn. The fire cracked and hissed, violently consuming the dry wood, throwing dancing, warm shadows against the walls. It was the first true warmth she had felt in years. By the second week of her exile, the cabin had transformed from a rotting shell into a highly functional, fiercely guarded sanctuary. She had constructed a makeshift mattress from thick layers of dense, springy spruce branches, covering them entirely with her heavy sheepskin cloak. She had found a pristine, half-frozen stream a mile to the west. Each morning, she broke the ice with the heavy pommel of her hunting knife to fill her leather canteen. The water was so violently cold it made her teeth ache and her throat constrict, but it was pure. She foraged for late-season roots, digging through the deep snow with frozen fingers to unearth bitter tubers. The meals were stark, joyless affairs of pure sustenance, but they belonged entirely to her. Her days were defined by silence and grueling labor. Her nights were defined by the hearth and the silver hairbrush. Every evening, as the brutal winter darkness fully consumed the territory, Lyra would sit cross-legged before the small, snapping fire. The dancing light cast long, flickering shadows across the mud-chinked walls. She would unwrap the white linen cloth with deliberate slowness and carefully extract her mother's solitary heirloom. The solid metal was incredibly heavy, a dense, physical anchor to her legally erased lineage. The chill of the silver slowly absorbed the heat from her palms as she ran her calloused thumb over the intricately engraved crescent moon. She could feel the deep, tarnished grooves of the crest, a tactile reminder of the bloodline that her former alpha believed he could simply sign away on a piece of paper. Then she would lift the brush to her dark hair. The repetitive rhythmic motion was a deep, solitary meditation, stroke after stroke. The stiff bristles pulled through the tangles, grounding her entirely in the present physical moment. The public erasure was designed to shatter her, to turn her into a weeping, pathetic creature begging for scraps of validation. But the profound isolation was rebuilding her. The quiet cabin was a crucible, burning away the toxic, lingering residue of the pack and leaving behind only the hardened, unbreakable core of her bloodline. Not used, not owned, chosen by the stones. The heavy, suffocating silence of the forest was no longer a threat. It was a fiercely protective blanket. As she lay down on her spruce branch bed, the ambient hum of the ancient standing stones outside lulled her into a deep, dreamless sleep. She was completely alone, utterly unprotected by any pack laws, but she had never felt safer. The massive, terrifying shift in the atmosphere occurred on the 20th day of her exile. Lyra was kneeling beside the frozen stream, her heavy hunting knife gripped tightly in her right hand as she chipped methodically away at the thick layer of morning ice. The sky above the dense canopy was a bruised, sullen grey, threatening a massive, devastating snowfall. The temperature had plummeted drastically overnight, turning the air brittle, sharp, and incredibly hostile. Every breath she took felt like swallowing tiny, jagged shards of glass. Suddenly, the ambient noise of the woods completely vanished. It was not a gradual, natural fading of sound. It was an immediate, violent cessation of all biological life. The distant, rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker ceased. The soft, continuous rustling of the wind through the pine needles stopped dead. Even the water rushing beneath the frozen surface of the stream seemed to instantly mute itself. The entire forest was holding its breath. A heavy, atmospheric weight slammed down over the clearing. It was a suffocating, almost electrical pressure that made the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand up in stark terror. The overwhelming scent of petrichor, crushed ozone and raw, freezing power flooded her senses. It completely annihilated the natural, earthy smell of the pines, replacing it with the sharp, metallic tang of an impending, catastrophic thunderstorm. Her inner wolf, which had been resting peacefully in the dark corners of her mind, suddenly lunged forward. It did not whimper in fear. It did not bare its teeth in aggressive, territorial defiance. Instead, the ancient beast dropped completely low to the ground within her subconscious, adopting a posture of absolute instinctual reverence. Lyra froze. She slowly withdrew her knife from the ice, keeping her grip agonizingly tight on the wrapped leather hilt. She stood up. She did not make any sudden, jerky movements. She turned around with a slow, measured pivot, her storm-grey eyes scanning the dense, shadowy tree line directly across the frozen water. He was standing perfectly still between two massive, ancient oaks. It was a wolf, but the mundane word felt entirely, laughably insufficient to describe the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the beast. He was easily twice the size of a standard pack alpha, his massive, heavily muscled shoulders rising much higher than her own chest. His fur was not the common brown or matted grey of the woodland shifters. It was a pristine, blinding shade of luminescent silver, looking exactly like liquid moonlight poured directly over a frame of heavy, corded muscle. The beast radiated a raw, lethal danger, a terrifying reminder that they were small things in a world of teeth. But it was his eyes that locked her permanently in place. They were glowing, molten silver. They swirled with an ancient, fathomless intelligence that completely transcended any form of animal instinct. The massive silver wolf watched her. He did not growl. He did not bare his massive, bone-crushing fangs to assert his absolute dominance over the territory. He simply stood there, a terrifying, silent god of the winter woods, observing her with an intensity that made her skin physically burn, despite the sub-zero temperature. Lyra did not run. Running from an apex predator of this magnitude was a guaranteed invitation to be hunted and slaughtered. She anchored her heavy boots to the snow-covered bank, kept her spine perfectly, rigidly straight, and stared directly back into those glowing silver eyes. She adamantly refused to show weakness. She had stood unblinking before a cruel man in a crowded keep. She would certainly not cower before a beast in the wild. For a long, agonizing, tense minute, the two of them simply existed in the heavy, crushing silence. The only audible sound was the harsh, rapid thudding of her own heart, echoing loudly in her ears. Then the beast moved. He took one massive, deliberate step forward out of the deep shadows. The snow crunched incredibly loudly beneath his massive paws. He lowered his enormous head in a distinct, highly calculated gesture of non-aggression. It was a physical, undeniable sign of immense voluntary restraint. As he stepped fully into the pale, anemic daylight, the sharp edges of his silver form began to violently blur and shift. The transformation was breathtakingly fluid. It was a violent but flawlessly controlled rearrangement of bone, muscle, and ancient magic. The bright silver fur dissolved into a thick, swirling mist, replaced instantly by the dark, heavy fabrics of a royal mantle. The sheer kinetic force of the shift sent a localized shockwave of displaced air rushing across the clearing, rattling the barren branches above. Within 3 heartbeats, the terrifying beast was gone. He was replaced by an even more terrifying man. King Corvin Valerius stepped onto the frozen bank. He was impossibly tall, his broad, formidable shoulders wrapped entirely in a thick cloak of black wolf fur. His face was all sharp, aristocratic angles, seemingly carved from the exact same unforgiving granite as the standing stones behind her cabin. His hair was a dark, raven black, sweeping back from a forehead that bore the faint, silvery scar of an old, heavy crown. But his eyes remained exactly the same. They were striking, luminescent silver, heavily burdened with the crushing weight of 1,000 years of sovereign rule. He was the Moonlit Wolf King, the supreme ruler of all shifters in the realm, a legend strictly whispered in the dark, fearful corners of every pack keep. He looked completely, deeply exhausted. Dark, heavy shadows bruised the pale skin beneath his eyes. His posture, while impeccably straight, carried the immense, agonizing burden of absolute authority. He was a man who had spent decades relentlessly hunting for something he deeply believed was permanently lost to the ashes of history. Corvin did not advance toward her. He meticulously maintained a strict, highly respectful distance of 10 paces. He implicitly understood the extreme, volatile danger of cornering an unprotected rogue female in the wild. He raised his hand slowly, deliberately keeping his physical movements telegraphed and incredibly smooth, showing her his empty palms. He wore heavy, dark leather gloves, but thick, solid silver chains were wrapped securely around his massive wrists. The metal links clinked softly against each other, a sharp, metallic sound in the dead silence. They were highly visible, self-inflicted restraints. He wore them to physically handicap his own lethal speed, to visually prove to the world that his terrifying, dangerous instincts were voluntarily bound. "I mean you no harm," the king said. His voice was a low, incredibly resonant rumble that vibrated entirely through her chest cavity. It was not the aggressive, commanding, weaponized tone that Kaelin constantly used to force biological compliance. It was a voice of deep, patient authority, tinged with a raw roughness that she did not know how to accurately read. It was the careful voice of a sovereign, who had spent his entire life learning how not to frighten fragile people. Lyra kept her hunting knife angled strictly downward, the leather hilt warm against her palm, but she adamantly did not sheathe the blade. "You are extremely far from the royal capital, King Corvin." She did not ask how he had found her. She did not drop to her freezing knees, and she did not avert her steady gaze. She simply stated the geopolitical fact of his impossible, highly irregular presence. Her voice was remarkably steady, completely devoid of the trembling fear or breathless awe that usually accompanied the sudden appearance of the supreme monarch. Corvin's silver eyes tracked the subtle, defensive movement of her blade. He silently acknowledged her highly guarded posture without offering a single ounce of condemnation. His gaze then drifted slowly up to intensely study her face. He took in the stark, hollowed lines of her physical exhaustion. He noted the austere grey wool tunic, the heavy, unbleached sheepskin cloak, and the raw, completely blistered skin of her working hands. He looked past her. His sharp gaze swept analytically over the dilapidated forester's cabin, the crude pine-bough window, and finally rested heavily on the ancient standing stones that pulsed with latent wild magic. He paused. His glowing eyes narrowed slightly as he focused intently on her sternum, right over the exact physiological spot where the severed mating mark lay hidden beneath her heavy wool clothing. He could literally see the eidetic, bleeding void. He could smell the sharp, acidic ashes of her public betrayal lingering heavily beneath the clean scent of the pines. "You carry absolutely no pack scent," Corvin noted. His voice dropped a full octave, becoming softer, almost painfully, devastatingly gentle. "Your ties have been violently severed. You have been legally erased. I am surviving," Lyra corrected him coldly. Her chin tipped upward, adjusting her rigid posture to add another defensive fraction of an inch to her height. She would not accept pity, not even from a king. The pity of powerful men was a dangerous, highly corrosive thing. "I require no assistance, and I offer no submission." A profound, incredibly heavy silence stretched between them across the frozen stream. Corvin did not react to her sharp, defensive tone with alpha anger. He did not demand her immediate respect. Instead, a strange, profound sadness flickered briefly in his ancient silver eyes. He looked at the rigidly straight, completely unyielding line of her spine. He saw the horrific, systemic abuse she had endured, a trauma written entirely in the defensive rigidity of her posture and the tight grip on her knife. "You should never have been forced to survive," Corvin said quietly. The words were not an imperial order. They were a solemn, devastatingly accurate acknowledgement of her entirely unrecognized worth. He looked at her not as a discarded, broken rogue, but as the only incredibly precious thing left in a burning, ruined world. "You are the true Silverthorn," the Royal Alpha declared softly, his chained hands dropping slowly to his sides, "and I have been relentlessly searching for you for a very, very long time." Lyra's breath hitched, a tiny, entirely involuntary physical reaction that betrayed her iron facade. The massive king did not violently push his advantage. He did not step forward into her fiercely guarded space. He did not demand her absolute compliance. He simply stood in the freezing snow, heavily restrained by his own cold silver chains, offering her the one single thing she had been completely, brutally denied: absolute, unconditional recognition. The silence of the whispering woods was a sacred, heavy thing. It stretched between the exiled woman and the terrifying sovereign, thick with the scent of ozone and impending snow. The freezing air seemed to crystallize in her lungs, yet Lyra Silverthorn did not immediately lower her hunting knife. She stood her ground on the freezing bank of the stream, her grey eyes locked onto the glowing, molten silver gaze of the man who could decimate entire armies with a single command. The ancient trees groaned under the weight of the winter frost, their branches snapping like brittle bones in the distance, but neither of them flinched. The frozen water rushed over the ice-slicked stones, a harsh, metallic sound that mirrored the tension vibrating in the air between them. King Corvin Valerius did not move to breach her defenses. He remained perfectly, deliberately still. The heavy silver chains wrapped around his massive wrists clinked faintly as the bitter wind caught the edges of his dark fur mantle. It was a stark, physical manifestation of his immense self-restraint. The thick metal links were solidly forged, gleaming with a dull, lethal weight against the pristine white snow. He was a predator built for slaughter, a creature of absolute violence, yet he stood before her with his head bowed and his hands bound, offering her complete autonomy. He was waiting for her permission. The supreme ruler of all shifters was waiting for a discarded, legally erased rogue to grant him entry into her fractured world. He did not let his dominant aura leak into the clearing. Instead, he pulled it tightly inward, suffocating his own predatory instincts so she could breathe. Gradually, Lyra lowered the blade. She did not sheath it, but the rigid, defensive line of her shoulders relaxed by a fraction of an inch. The metal was freezing against her palm, grounding her racing pulse. "The wind is turning," Lyra said. Her voice was remarkably steady, though her lungs burned with the frigid air. "A king will freeze just as quickly as a rogue in this storm." It was not a formal invitation, but it was enough. Corvin bowed his head once, a gesture of profound, unearned respect, and followed her across the hardened earth toward the dilapidated forester's cabin. When Corvin stepped through the low, rotting wooden doorway, the spatial dynamics of the tiny sanctuary instantly warped. He was impossibly large, his broad shoulders practically brushing the mud-chinked walls, his dark crown of hair grazing the sagging cedar beams. Yet he moved with a terrifying, liquid grace. He intentionally kept his physical footprint as small as possible. Immediately since stepping into the deepest corner of the room, far away from her spruce branch bed, he did not pace. He did not inspect her meager belongings. He simply lowered his massive frame onto the cold, uneven floorboards, crossing his long legs and resting his chained wrists heavily on his knees. The floorboards groaned beneath his immense weight, but he remained perfectly still, a dark monument of patience in the center of her ruin. Lyra moved to the stone hearth. The domestic routine was a necessary anchor. The blistered skin on her palms throbbed, a harsh reminder of her sudden plunge from pack royalty to a freezing, solitary exile. Yet she did not weep. She had left her tears in the courtyard of the Winterborn Keep. Her hands were numb, the broken skin cracking slightly, as she added another dry birch log to the fragile golden flames. The scent of wood smoke filled the tiny space, cutting through the biting scent of winter. She filled a small, battered iron pot with the pristine ice water she had chipped from the stream, tossing in a handful of the bitter, foraged tubers she had gathered the day before. It was a meager, pathetic meal. It was certainly not food meant for a sovereign. Yet she did not apologize for it. Apologies were for women who had something to be ashamed of. They existed in absolute silence while the water by degrees began to boil. The only sounds in the cabin were the snapping of the dry wood and the faint, rhythmic hum of the ancient standing stones vibrating through the frozen earth beneath the floor. When the tubers were soft, Lyra poured the starchy, steaming broth into 2 carved wooden bowls. She walked across the small room and offered one to the king. Corvin looked at the crude wooden vessel, then looked up at her stark, exhausted face. He took the bowl with immense care, his large, leather-clad fingers brushing deliberately against the rough wood, strictly avoiding any accidental contact with her skin. He brought the bitter broth to his lips and drank. His jaw was clenched tight, the muscles corded and rigid. For a sovereign who commanded the feasts of the high realm, this bitter root broth should have been an insult. But the chained sovereign drank it as if it were the elixir of life, simply because she was the one who had poured it. He did not flinch at the bitter taste. He did not complain about the freezing drafts leaking through the pine bough window. He accepted her meager hospitality with a quiet, overwhelming gratitude that made the hollow crater in Lyra's chest ache with a completely new, unfamiliar pressure. It was the heavy weight of being entirely seen without being judged. As he set the empty wooden bowl down, the thick leather of his heavy gloves caught on the rough floorboards. Corvin shifted his weight, and the heavy silver chains around his wrists snagged violently against his forearm. A sharp, metallic hiss escaped his teeth. The chains dug brutally into his flesh, a self-imposed torture he bore without a single complaint. Lyra's eyes instantly tracked the movement. The thick leather glove had been pushed back, revealing the skin just beneath the heavy silver bindings. It was completely raw. The constant, brutal friction of the restraining metal had worn completely through his epidermis, leaving a jagged, bleeding lattice of torn flesh, and beneath the fresh blood lay a chaotic, horrific canvas of older horrors. His forearms were covered in a dense network of thick, silvery burn scars and deep, jagged claw marks. They were the physical remnants of 1,000 ancient brutal wars, fought in the dark to keep the realm safe. "You are bleeding," Lyra stated quietly. "It is a minor inconvenience," the massive wolf rumbled, moving to tug the heavy leathered glove back over the wound. "The chains must remain." "I did not ask you to remove the chains," she replied, her voice flat, entirely devoid of the trembling fear he was so accustomed to hearing. "But a wound left unattended in this cold will fester. Hold out your arm." Corvin froze. His silver eyes widened imperceptibly. No one commanded the supreme monarch. No one dared to approach him when his blood was drawn, terrified that the scent of violence would trigger his lethal, ancient instincts. But the woman standing before him did not smell of fear. She smelled of frozen pine, old magic, and an unbreakable, quiet defiance. Deliberately, he extended his massive, chained arm toward her. The metal clinked, a stark sound in the quiet room. Lyra knelt on the floorboards beside him. She was very good at being unseen, at making her movements gentle and non-threatening. She took a clean scrap of white linen, dipping it into the remaining hot water in the iron pot. When she reached out to clean the raw, bleeding chafe mark, her blistered, freezing fingers accidentally brushed against the solid muscle of his forearm. A violent, electrical shock rippled through the suffocating air. The heat radiating from the king's skin was absolutely staggering. It was like pressing her freezing hands against the surface of a burning sun. Lyra gasped, a small, sharp sound, but she did not pull away. The sheer, raw vulnerability of the moment pressed down on them both. Her silver eyes met his glowing, molten gaze in the dim light. She did not flinch away from the monstrous scars, and he did not pull his bleeding arm back from her icy touch. The instant her skin made contact with his, the dull, agonizing ache of her severed mating mark, the wound Kaelan had inflicted, suddenly flared, then immediately numbed. The pain simply dissolved, evaporating under the intense, golden warmth of the sovereign's physical presence. Her wolf, which had been whimpering in the dark for weeks, suddenly settled into a deep, profound state of rest. Corvin's breathing turned ragged. His chest heaved beneath the dark fur mantle. His inner beast, a creature of pure, ancient destruction, let out a massive, rattling purr that vibrated the loose floorboards. He squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw clenching so tightly the muscles threatened to snap. He was fighting a colossal, internal war to remain perfectly still, terrified that if he moved even a fraction of an inch, he would accidentally frighten away the only safe, gentle touch he had experienced in centuries. The silver chains rattled against his tremors, but he forced his arm to remain completely immovable. Lyra methodically cleaned the dried blood from the heavy silver links. She wiped away the grime from the deep, jagged scars, her touch incredibly light, a quiet balm against his horrific history. She did not ask about the battles. She did not ask why the supreme ruler felt the need to shackle himself. She simply offered him the quiet, practical compassion of a survivor. The contrast between her cold, steady hands and his burning skin created an anchor that neither of them had anticipated. When she finally wrapped a dry strip of linen around the chafed skin, binding it securely beneath the heavy silver chain, she sat back on her heels. The bleeding had stopped, the wound was bound, the interior of the cabin had grown entirely dark, illuminated only by the dying, golden embers of the hearth. The storm outside had broken, burying the whispering woods beneath a thick, silent blanket of heavy snow. The absolute isolation of the territory pressed deeply against the cedar walls, completely separating them from the political rot of the outside world. Here there were no decrees, no betrayals, only the wood smoke and the quiet breathing of two isolated souls. Lyra moved back to her small spruce branch bed. The nightly ritual called to her. She reached into the depths of her leather rucksack and pulled out the small white linen bundle. The heavy canvas bag was cold, smelling of the frozen earth. Corvin watched her from the shadows, his glowing silver eyes tracking her every movement with absolute, unwavering focus. He did not blink. She unwrapped the cloth, revealing the silver hairbrush. The firelight caught the heavily tarnished metal, illuminating the large, intricately engraved crescent moon on its back. The dull, tarnished silver gleamed softly. It was a heavy, ancient thing, far too old to belong to the gaudy, modern court of Alpha Kalan Vane. The crescent moon's sigil practically vibrated in the presence of the true sovereign. It was her only heirloom from her deceased mother. The moment the king saw the crest, the atmosphere in the tiny cabin shifted violently. The ambient temperature spiked. The smell of ozone and raw power flooded the enclosed space, pressing against Lyra's eardrums with immense pressure. Corvin's breath hitched. He stared at the battered silver object as if it were the holiest relic in the entire realm. The ancient magic lingering on the brush called directly to the blood in his veins. Lyra lifted the heavy brush to her dark hair, stroke after stroke. The repetitive, rhythmic motion was a deep, solitary meditation. The stiff bristles pulled through the tangles, grounding her entirely in the present physical moment. She did not look at the king. She simply allowed the quiet rhythm to soothe her exhausted mind. Her spine remained straight. She was unbent. We are small things in a world of teeth, but as she lowered the brush, a massive shadow eclipsed the firelight. Corvin had moved. He did not walk. He simply appeared before her, a towering, terrifying force of nature. Lyra's breath caught in her throat, her spine instantly locking into its rigid, defensive posture. Her hand drifted instinctively toward the hunting knife resting on the bed. But the sovereign did not reach for her. He did not try to claim the silver heirloom. Instead, the moonlit wolf king sank by degrees to his knees. The heavy silver chains clattered loudly against the warped, uneven floorboards. He lowered his massive, heavily scarred frame until he was completely, utterly dwarfed by her seated position on the low bed. He bowed his dark head, exposing the vulnerable, scarred nape of his neck to her hunting knife. It was an act of absolute, terrifying submission. A king who bowed to no one, kneeling on the dirt floor of a rotting cabin, offering his life to a discarded woman. The decree signed in that keep is nothing but forged ash, Corvin swore, his resonant voice thick with a raw, bleeding devotion. The stones know their architect, the moon knows its daughter. You are the true Luna of this realm, and I will burn the entire world to the ground before I let anyone erase your name again. Lyra stared down at the broad, powerful shoulders of the kneeling god. She did not speak. She did not need to. For the first time since the winter banquet was announced, the freezing ice in her veins began, by careful increments, to thaw. The agonizing cold of the rejection was finally giving way to the undeniable warmth of a true fated bond. The suffocating, cloying heat of the grand high hall pressed against the ancient stone walls of the Winterbourne Pack Keep, 30 miles to the south, drowning the space in a cacophony of stolen triumph. The Grand High Hall, usually a place of austere, cold judgment, had been aggressively transformed into a garish spectacle of unearned wealth. The heavy, historic grey tapestries that had hung from the stone walls for centuries. The tapestries depicting Lyra's ancestors in glorious, bloody battle had been violently torn down. In their place hung massive swaths of brilliant midnight blue silk, the chosen colour of the new nobility. The stone floors were littered with crushed petals, a pathetic attempt to mask the scent of treachery. The air inside the cavernous space was uncomfortably hot, heated by 4 massive roaring hearths that spit angry embers onto the flagstones. The delicate, earthy scent of pine had been entirely eradicated, replaced by the heavy, cloying stench of crushed jasmine perfume, roasting fat, and vast quantities of overspiced, heavily sweetened wine. It was a sensory overload designed explicitly to mask the underlying, inescapable stench of political decay. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the pure, quiet cold of the Whispering Woods, a false warmth built entirely on a foundation of lies and forged parchment. This night was the grand banquet, the official, public celebration of the decree of erasure. In the centre of the chaotic, swarming room stood Sienna Lockhart. She was draped in a gown of spun silver and deep blue velvet, the bodice encrusted with hundreds of tiny, glittering diamonds that caught the firelight like sharp teeth. She laughed loudly, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the low drone of the gathered crowd. A dozen minor lords and ambitious sycophants crowded around her, their heads bowed in eager, pathetic submission. She twirled a crystal goblet in her manicured hand, reveling in the absolute theft of another woman's birthright. Miss Lady Silverthorn, a young, ambitious alpha from the eastern borders, purred, raising a golden goblet in her direction. The name suits you infinitely better than the quiet shadow who previously wore it. Sienta smiled, her crimson-painted lips curling into a mask of pure toxic vanity. The old ways were dull, she declared, her voice carrying easily across the hall. A true noble requires ambition. We are elevating this territory. We are finally stepping out of the mud and into the light. Additional sycophantic laughter followed. Further goblets clashed together. The theft of the sacred lineage was being celebrated with cheap wine and cheaper flattery. No one dared to mention the silent, unbending woman who had walked away into the freezing woods. They were too busy gorging themselves on her stolen legacy. At the head of the long timber table, sitting heavily upon his carved oak throne, Alpha Caelan Vane watched the spectacle with a dark, brooding intensity. He wore his ceremonial furs, looking every inch the powerful, untouchable ruler he believed himself to be. The decree of erasure sat framed upon the mantle, displaying his heavy blood seal for all to witness. Yet, beneath the arrogant veneer, a deep, persistent biological wrongness gnawed at the edges of his sanity. His thunderous gaze tracked Sienna's movements, waiting for the surge of pride and satisfaction that should accompany his brilliant political maneuver. It never came. Instead, there was only a vast, freezing hollow crater right beneath his sternum, the exact spot where the fated mate bond had anchored him to the earth for Sis was now completely, terrifyingly empty. His inner wolf, usually a proud and dominant force, was pacing frantically within his mind, clawing at the walls of his consciousness in absolute panic. It recognized the catastrophic mistake Caelan had made, even if the man himself refused to acknowledge it. He drank deeply from his heavy golden goblet, letting the burning, spiced wine sear his throat, desperately trying to drown out the phantom ache. He told himself it was merely the physiological shock of the severing. He told himself that the absolute compliance of his pack, the fawning lords, and the beautiful, ambitious woman wearing the stolen name were worth the quiet, nagging agony in his chest. He was a king in his own mind, entirely blind to the catastrophic ruin he had invited into his home. Standing in the deep, cold shadows near the back of the dais, Elder Brannock Vance did not drink. The frail old man leaned heavily on his carved wooden staff, his knuckles stark white from the immense crushing pressure. His faded eyes were not fixed on the dancing sycophants or the arrogant Alpha Kalen Vane. His gaze was locked entirely on the far end of the great hall. There, looming out of the stone wall like the mouth of a dormant beast, stood the ancient moon gates. They were massive, twin arches of solid, heavily tarnished silver, deeply embedded into the very foundation of the keep. The intricate runic carvings on their surface matched the crest on the old silver hairbrush perfectly. According to the sacred, unalterable laws of the realm, the gates were the physical manifestation of the Pack's legitimacy. They were designed to open only to the touch of the true, fated bloodline, a magical conduit to the realm's high throne. They had remained completely dark and lifeless since the moment Lyra crossed the border. Elder Brannock Vance felt a cold, acidic sweat break out across his deeply wrinkled brow. He could feel the ancient magic of the land souring around them. The shadows in the corners of the keep seemed to be growing longer, sharper and significantly colder, completely immune to the roaring fires in the hearths. The ambient pressure in the room was wrong. It felt exactly like the terrifying, suffocating silence that immediately preceded a catastrophic avalanche. The stones themselves were rejecting the false name. "They are celebrating a corpse," Brannock muttered under his breath, his voice barely a papery rasp against the loud, chaotic music. Sienna pranced toward the dais, her silver skirts sweeping over the uneven flagstones. She approached Kalen, completely ignoring the dormant, massive silver gates behind his throne. She reached out, her sharp crimson nails trailing lightly over the dark fur of his mantle. "The entire Western Territory has sent their pledges, my Alpha," Sienna murmured, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "By midnight, the name Silverthorn will be legally recognized across every border. The erasure will be absolute." Kalen looked down at her. He forced a hard, arrogant smile to his lips, pushing down the agonizing, hollow, phantom pain in his chest. "Let them pledge," he commanded, his voice a low, heavy rumble that demanded compliance. "This evening, we bury the past. This evening, we prove that power belongs to those bold enough to take it." The crowd erupted into a deafening roar of approval. The musicians struck up a faster, more frenetic tune. The Winterborn Pack danced wildly in the suffocating heat, completely, utterly oblivious to the massive, terrifying storm of silver and shadows that was currently gathering in the quiet depths of the whispering woods. They did not know that the true Luna had already been found. They did not know that King Corvin Valerius, with his glowing silver eyes and heavy metal chains, had already sworn to burn their stone-stolen nobility to ash. All they knew was the music, the wine, and the arrogant, fatal delusion that they had actually won. The musicians in the high hall were in the middle of a frantic, joyous reel. The stringed instruments whined and plucked at a fever pitch, driving the assembled sycophants into a sweaty, chaotic frenzy. The heavy air was absolutely saturated with the cloying stench of crushed jasmine, roasting fat, and the arrogance of a pack that believed it had successfully rewritten history. Then, the 4 massive roaring hearths lining the stone walls extinguished simultaneously. It was not a gradual, natural dying of the flames. It was an instantaneous, violent snuffing. The roaring fires were simply erased from existence in the span of a single heartbeat, plunging the cavernous room into an eerie, suffocating twilight. The thick grey smoke from the dead timber hung suspended in the air, instantly freezing into rigid, floating tendrils. The sudden, catastrophic drop in temperature was so severe that the breath of the dancing wolves materialized into sharp white plumes. The music died. A lone fiddle let out a pathetic, screeching scrape before the player dropped his bow in absolute, primal terror. The ambient pressure in the room shifted with the crushing weight of a falling mountain. The cloying scent of Sienna Lockhart's expensive perfume and the heavy aroma of overspiced wine were violently ripped from the atmosphere. They were entirely annihilated, replaced by the sharp metallic tang of ozone, petrichor, and the distinct, terrifying smell of a catastrophic winter storm. It was the scent of raw, unadulterated power. At the far end of the hall, the heavy, iron-bound double doors, massive barricades that required the combined strength of 4 heavily muscled sentries to simply pivot, did not swing open. They detonated. The thick iron hinges snapped like dry twigs. The heavy timber beams splintered into 1,000 jagged projectiles, blasting inward with the concussive force of a localized hurricane. The 2 armed guards stationed at the threshold were thrown backward like discarded ragdolls, skidding limply across the uneven flagstones. The violent shockwave of displaced air blew through the hall, tearing the midnight blue silk banners down from the walls and shattering every crystal goblet resting on the long oak table. Wine spilled across the stones and instantly crystallized into dark red ice. Through the gaping, ruined threshold, the nightmare entered. He did not roar. He did not snarl. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of his physical presence was infinitely worse than any aggressive vocalization. A massive, legendary beast stepped out of the howling winter night and into the violated keep. It was a wolf of impossible proportions, his heavy shoulders rising far above the heads of the tallest warriors in the room. His fur was a blinding, pristine shade of luminescent silver, radiating a cold, ethereal light that cast long skeletal shadows across the terrified crowd, but it was the sheer, suffocating density of his aura that truly decimated the room. The absolute, sovereign command of the legendary ruler flooded the enclosed space. It was not a physical attack, it was a biological imperative. Every single shifter in the high hall dropped. They did not kneel out of political respect. They were physically, brutally forced to the floor by the sheer gravity of their own instinctual submission. Knees cracked painfully against the freezing flagstones. Proud, arrogant minor lords who had been laughing a moment prior were suddenly pressed flat against the ground, their faces smashed into the crushed petals. Unable to draw a single complete breath, their internal beasts whimpered in unison, paralyzed by the overwhelming, lethal proximity of the apex predator of their entire species. At the head of the ruined table, Alpha Kalen Vane gripped the carved arms of his heavy oak throne. His knuckles were stark white, his entire muscular frame trembling violently as he fought a losing war against his own biology. His pale eyes were wide with a terror he could not mathematically comprehend. The crater in his chest, the empty, bleeding void where his fated mate Bond had once resided, suddenly felt as though it had been packed with crushed glass. He tried to stand, to assert his territorial dominance over the invading beast, but the sovereign pressure simply pushed him back down into the wood, pinning him there like a helpless insect. Then the pack saw the woman walking perfectly in step beside the monster. Lyra, Silverthorn, entered her former home. She did not cower beneath the terrifying shadow of the massive silver beast. She did not walk a step behind him in submission, nor did she rush ahead in eager vindication. She walked precisely at his side, perfectly synchronized with his heavy, deliberate strides. She still wore the simple, austere dress of grey spun wool. Her heavy leather boots struck the freezing floorboards with a calm, measured cadence. Her dark hair was wind-blown, her skin pale from the bitter cold of the whispering woods, yet she looked more regal than any queen who had ever occupied the dais. The entire pack stared up at her from their hands and knees. They had expected her to be dead, swallowed entirely by the unforgiving wilderness. They had celebrated her erasure, yet here she was, unbent and unbroken, escorted by a god. Lyra did not gloat. She did not cast hateful glares at the minor lords who had eagerly nodded along to her banishment. She simply looked straight ahead, her spine a rigid line of forged steel. Her internal wolf sat tall and entirely unafraid, anchored by the massive presence beside her. We are small things in a world of teeth, but today the largest teeth in the realm belonged to her protector. The massive silver beast halted in the exact center of the ruined hall. He lowered his enormous head, a highly calculated, deliberate pause. The sharp edges of his luminescent form began to blur, dissolving into a violent, swirling mist of silver magic and dark shadows. The kinetic force of the transformation sent a second, smaller shockwave, rippling over the bowed heads of the crowd. When the mist instantly evaporated, King Corvin Valerius stood in the beast's place. He was impossibly tall, draped in his heavy black fur mantle. The dark, raven-black hair swept back from his pale aristocratic face, framing eyes of glowing, molten silver, and wrapped securely around his thick wrists were the massive, solidly forged silver chains. The metal links clinked softly in the dead, suffocating silence of the room. It was a terrifying visual paradox. A man holding absolute, lethal power, voluntarily shackling himself, proving to every soul in the room that his violence was entirely, terrifyingly controlled. Corvin did not look at the cowering lords. He did not look at the sputtering, paralyzed Kalen. His glowing silver eyes swept slowly over the room with the cold, detached judgment of an executioner. "I have traveled across the frozen expanse of my kingdom," the sovereign said. His voice was a low, incredibly resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, rattling the teeth in the skulls of the kneeling pack. It was not a shout. It was a quiet, devastating statement of absolute fact. "I have listened to the ancient stones weep," Corvin continued, his chained hands resting loosely at his sides. "I have smelled the rot of a forged decree bleeding into the sacred earth. The laws of this realm were not written on parchment to be erased by the whims of arrogant boys." Kalen gasped, his fingers digging gouges into the armrests of his throne. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to force his vocal cords to function, to offer some pathetic political justification to the supreme monarch. The words died entirely in his throat. The king's aura was an iron hand wrapped tightly around his windpipe. Corvin shifted his molten gaze toward the dais. The heavy silence stretched, pulling the tension so tight it threatened to snap the structural pillars of the keep. "Let the one who legally claims the ancestral name of Silverthorn step forward," Corvin commanded. The words hung in the freezing air, a lethal trap completely disguised as a royal summons. Beside the trembling Alpha, Sienna Lockhart slowly lifted her head. The mistress was entirely, hopelessly blinded by her own delusional ambition. She did not understand the nature of the violent power standing in the center of the hall. She did not comprehend the quiet, lethal fury radiating from the chained monarch. She saw only a king. She believed, with the staggering arrogance of a true usurper, that this grand, terrifying entrance was a royal validation of her newly acquired nobility. The decree had been signed in blood. The minor lords had bowed to her. She believed the realm itself was simply arriving to formally acknowledge her elevation. Lyra watched from the center of the room. Her grey eyes remained perfectly neutral. She knew exactly what the ancient magic of the land did to those who falsely claimed its authority. She had felt the deep, resonant hum of the standing stones. She knew the earth was starving for justice. Sienna smoothed her hands down the front of her obscenely expensive gown. The midnight blue silk rustled loudly in the quiet room. The hundreds of tiny, glittering diamonds encrusted on her bodice caught the pale, anemic light filtering through the shattered doors. She forced her trembling legs to straighten, lifting her chin in a pathetic imitation of true aristocratic grace. She ignored the warning whimpers of the pack members, groveling at the base of the dais. "I am here, Your Grace," Sienna announced. Her voice was thin, completely lacking the resonant depth of a true Luna, but it carried a sharp, desperate edge of entitlement. She unhooked her fingers from Kaelin's rigid shoulder. She stepped out from behind the heavy oak table. "I am the newly recognized noble of this territory," the mistress continued, her false confidence inflating with every syllable. "By the blood seal of the Alpha, the lineage is mine." Corvin did not move. He did not blink. He simply waited. Sienna placed her delicate, silver-heeled shoe onto the top step of the dais, preparing to descend to the main floor. To formally greet the sovereign, she lifted her heavy skirts, a triumphant, cruel smile touching the corners of her crimson-painted lips. She took the first step down. The moment the sole of her shoe made physical contact with the lower flagstone, the ancient magic of the keep reacted. It was not a spectacular explosion of light or a violent burst of fire. It was a sound, a horrifying, wet, screeching sound of absolute decay, like 1,000 years of rot accelerating into a single microsecond. The solid, ancient grey flagstone beneath Sienna's foot instantly turned to pitch-black ash. Sienna shrieked as her footing vanished entirely. She stumbled heavily, her knee slamming into the corrupted stone. The impact did not meet solid rock. It met a deep, powdery void. The black ash was incredibly fine, completely devoid of any heat or moisture. It was the physical manifestation of total, unadulterated rejection. "What is this?" The mistress screamed, her voice shattering into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. She scrambled backward, frantically trying to pull herself up the stairs toward Kaelin's throne. But the corruption was already spreading. The magical rot radiated outward from the point of her impact. It moved with methodical, terrifying speed. The ancient stones of the dais hissed and bubbled, losing their structural integrity and collapsing into fine soot. The black ash consumed the crushed flower petals scattered across the floor, turning them instantly to dust. It crept rapidly up the steps, aggressively eating away at the heavy timber of the raised platform. Then it touched her dress. The midnight blue silk, the fabric she had paraded around as proof of her stolen nobility, did not catch fire. It simply ceased to be. The hem of the beautiful gown turned grey, then black, then disintegrated entirely into floating particles of dark soot. The diamonds encrusted on the fabric dulled instantly, losing their brilliant shine before cracking into worthless, cloudy pebbles that rained down into the growing pile of ash beneath her. "Kaelin, help me!" Sienna thrashed violently in the soot, her perfect manicured hands clawing desperately at the disintegrating stairs. The toxic, cloying scent of her jasmine perfume was entirely neutralized by the overwhelming, suffocating smell of dead earth and crushed minerals. The land itself was physically stripping her of her stolen identity. Kaelin lunged forward, throwing his weight against the invisible, crushing pressure of the sovereign's aura. He managed to force himself off the throne, his hand reaching out toward the terrified woman. "Stop!" the Alpha roared, his voice cracking wildly with panic. He looked desperately at the silver-eyed monarch. "Stop this! I signed the decree. I command this territory." "You command nothing," Corvin replied. The absolute, frigid calm in his voice was infinitely more terrifying than the Alpha's frantic screaming. The heavy chains clinked as he slightly shifted his stance. "You tampered with the foundation of the world, boy. The land does not recognize ink, it only recognizes truth." Kaelin's hand finally grabbed Sienna's outstretched wrist. He pulled with all his formidable strength, dragging her up from the collapsing lower stepsons. She collapsed onto the wooden floorboards near the base of the throne, sobbing hysterically. Her beautiful gown was entirely ruined, eaten away past the knees, leaving her covered in a thick, suffocating layer of pitch-black grime. Her hands were stained permanently with the soot of her own false ambition. She curled into a pathetic, trembling ball, completely stripped of her arrogant veneer. The black ash stopped spreading the exact moment she retreated from the lower floor. The magic of the keep established a stark, undeniable boundary. A massive, jagged crater of dark dust now separated the dais from the rest of the high hall. The earth had spoken its judgment. She could sit on a wooden chair, but she would never be permitted to walk the ancient stones of the realm again. Lyra stood perfectly still in the center of the hall, her heavy leather boots planted firmly on pristine, solid flagstones. She watched the woman who had stolen her life weeping in the dirt. She watched the man who had discarded her staring in absolute, uncomprehending horror at the ruin he had caused. She felt no sudden rush of vicious joy. She felt no overwhelming urge to mock them. The quiet, stoic dignity that had carried her through the freezing woods remained firmly intact. She was a woman who had learned how to survive in the dark, and she did not need their pathetic apologies to validate her existence. Elder Brannock Vance, still cowering in the deep shadows behind the throne, let his wooden staff clatter uselessly to the floorboards. The frail old man fell to his knees, his hands trembling violently as he pressed his forehead against the wood. He understood precisely what he was witnessing. The political games of the modern pack had just been violently crushed by the ancient, unbreakable laws of the fated bloodlines. Corvin turned his massive head slowly, his glowing silver eyes leaving the pathetic display on the dais, to look down at the woman standing beside him. The terrifying, lethal coldness in the sovereign's gaze completely vanished. When he looked at Lyra, his eyes softened, the molten silver dimming to a gentle, profound warmth that completely contradicted his monstrous reputation. He did not speak to her with the voice of a king commanding a subject. He spoke with the quiet, devastating reverence of a man who had finally found the only thing that could mend his fractured soul. "They built a kingdom of ash to replace you," Corvin murmured, his voice so quiet it was meant only for her ears. Yet the absolute silence of the room carried the words to every cowering wolf. They believed they could simply discard the foundation and keep the castle. But the stones remember their architect, Lyra. Lyra's breath hitched slightly in the freezing air, the dull, phantom ache in her chest, the lingering ghost of Kaelin's betrayal, was entirely, permanently gone, replaced by the heavy, solid warmth radiating from the man beside her. She did not reach out to touch him. She did not need to. The unbreakable, instinctual tether between them had already been forged in the quiet darkness of the forester's cabin. At the front of the room, Kaelin stared at his former mate. His storm-grey eyes were wide, the pupils dilated in a state of catastrophic shock. He looked at the simple grey wool of her dress, the heavy, practical boots, and the unbent, incredibly proud line of her spine. Then he looked at the massive, chained sovereign standing as her absolute, terrifying shield. The horrifying, undeniable truth finally pierced through the Alpha's arrogant delusion. He hadn't just discarded a quiet, inconvenient mate to elevate his favorite mistress. He had legally, publicly severed himself from the true Luna of the entire realm. He had thrown away the absolute pinnacle of their species, handing her directly into the waiting, fiercely protective arms of a god who could wipe his entire territory off the map with a single chained hand. The realization hit Kaelin with the physical force of a falling oak. His legs gave out. The arrogant Alpha who had signed the ruinous edict just weeks prior collapsed onto the wooden floorboards beside his weeping mistress, his hands gripping his hair as the crater in his chest finally violently tore itself completely open. The profound, suffocating silence following the broken Alpha's collapse was absolute. It was not the respectful, disciplined quiet of a loyal pack honoring their sovereign leader. It was the terrified, breathless paralysis of trapped prey entirely overwhelmed by the lethal proximity of an apex predator. The cavernous high hall, previously a sweltering, garish theater of stolen triumph, now felt like a massive stone tomb. The ambient temperature remained brutally, dangerously low. The thick grey smoke from the abruptly smothered hearths continued to hang suspended in the freezing air, freezing into rigid, floating tendrils of frost that clung to the shattered heavy timber beams of the ruined doors. Every breath taken by the cowering pack plumed into white vapour, a stark physical reminder of the winter that had been invited into their home the moment they exiled their true Luna. The air smelled sharp and metallic, like fresh snow mixed with the copper tang of sheer terror. On the dais, Kalen remained crumbled upon the wooden floorboards, his fingers digging viciously into his own scalp. The brutal, biological severing of his mate bond had previously been a dull, manageable ache, successfully masked by his arrogant political ambition and the cloying scent of heavily spiced wine. Now confronted by the terrifying, undeniable reality of his catastrophic mistake, the absolute finality of his loss flooded his nervous system. It was a physical agony that defied all medical logic. He could literally feel his internal beast thrashing in absolute, hopeless panic, clawing desperately at the walls of his consciousness as it mourned the permanent loss of the true Luna. He had traded a diamond forged in ancient magic for a handful of toxic, suffocating dirt, and the realization was a poison actively searing through his veins. The pain radiated from the empty space where his fated tether used to anchor him, leaving him hollow, gasping, and completely unmoored in his own territory. Beside him, the weeping mistress was nothing more than a pathetic, soot-covered shadow. Sienna remained curled into a tight, trembling ball at the edge of the jagged crater of black ash. The magnificent midnight blue silk of her stolen nobility was gone, completely eaten away by the ancient magic of the keep. Her skin was permanently stained with the dark, suffocating grime of her own false ambition, the physical manifestation of her deceit clinging to her pores. She did not dare to look up. She did not dare to speak. The crushing, sovereign pressure radiating from the center of the hall kept her physically pinned to the dirt, a harsh biological mandate that demanded absolute submission from a usurper. Every time she tried to draw a breath, the ash of her ruined gown choked her, a bitter reminder of the title she had tried to steal. King Corvin Valerius did not spare a single glance for the weeping woman or the broken man. The supreme monarch stood perfectly still in the dead center of the ruined hall, a towering monument of lethal, heavily restrained power. The dark, raven-black fur of his heavy mantle absorbed the pale, anemic moonlight filtering through the shattered entrance, casting long, abyssal shadows across the frozen floorboards. The thick, solidly forged silver chains wrapped tightly around his massive wrists clinked faintly when he shifted his weight, a sharp, metallic sound that sliced clean through the dead silence. He was a god of war who had voluntarily bound himself, entirely for the sake of the quiet woman standing beside him. He was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. The glowing, molten silver eyes of the chained sovereign deliberately swept over the hundreds of pack members currently pressing their faces into the freezing flagstones. He looked at the ambitious minor lords who had eagerly raised their golden goblets to celebrate a forged decree. He looked at the sycophants who had laughed while a sacred lineage was legally assassinated. His gaze was entirely devoid of hot, aggressive fury. Instead, it was filled with a cold, detached, and utterly terrifying judgment. The ambient pressure in the room increased with every passing second, making the stone walls groan under the weight of his absolute authority. "You believed a piece of paper could alter the foundation of the world," the sovereign rumbled. His voice was remarkably quiet, yet it carried an immense, resonant depth that vibrated powerfully through the uneven flagstones and rattled the iron sconces on the damp stone walls. It was a voice designed to command armies, currently weaponized to educate a room full of arrogant fools. The sound of it settled deep into the marrow of every wolf present, an ancient frequency that demanded instinctive, absolute obedience. "You celebrated the theft of a title," the Moonlit Wolf King continued, his chained hands resting loosely at his sides. "You believed the name Silverthorn was merely a political asset to be traded across a timber table. You are blind. You are entirely ignorant of the history sleeping beneath your own boots. That name is not a social rank. It is the blood of the first Luna. It is the architectural anchor of the Standing Stones, and it is the sacred, magical key to the high throne of this realm." A collective, shuddering gasp rippled through the cowering crowd. The minor lords squeezed their eyes shut, their bodies trembling uncontrollably against the freezing floorboards. They had eagerly participated in the public humiliation of a woman who held the literal biological keys to their species' survival. The crushing weight of their collective treason pressed down upon their spines, heavier than the massive stone blocks of the keep itself. They had exiled their only salvation, and now the god of their kind had arrived to collect the debt. In the deep freezing shadows behind the heavy oak throne, Elder Brannock Vance remained on his knees. The frail old man wept silently, tears tracking through the deep wrinkles of his face and dripping onto the wood, instantly freezing into tiny beads of ice. He had known the ancient laws, he had held the history in his hands, yet he had cowardly chosen to bend to the harsh reality of modern political survival. He had prioritized Kaelin's favor over the secret texts. Now, the ancient world had returned to aggressively correct his cowardice, and the old man knew with terrifying certainty that there would be no mercy for those who had forgotten the old ways. His political machinations were nothing but dust in the face of the true sovereign. Lyra watched the entire display with calm, unblinking, slate-colored eyes. She remained standing perfectly in step beside the massive sovereign, her simple dress of grey spun wool, a stark, brilliant contrast to the dark, lethal majesty of her protector. She did not cast hateful glares at the lords who had mocked her. She did not smile viciously at the ruined mistress crying in the ash. She simply observed the brutal, necessary re-establishment of the natural order. Lyra had always been very good at being unseen, at pulling her presence back until she was nothing but a quiet shadow. But today, anchored by the immense, burning warmth of the man beside her, she allowed herself to be fully, undeniably witnessed. The cold that permeated the hall did not touch her. Corvin's massive frame acted as a perfect, radiating shield against the frost. Deliberately, she reached beneath the heavy, unbleached sheepskin cloak draped over her shoulders. Her calloused, blistered fingers, hands that had chopped frozen wood and dug through the winter earth to survive, found the small, carefully wrapped linen bundle hidden in the deep pocket of her grey wool dress. The fabric was coarse and worn, a stark reminder of the harsh life she had been forced into. She pulled it out and unwrapped the cloth. The mother's old silver hairbrush emerged into the faint, silvery glow. It was a heavy, solid piece of metal, deeply tarnished by decades of constant, solitary touch. But as the ambient, raw power of the Moonlit Wolf King washed over the object, the intricately engraved crescent moon on the back of the brush began to react. The tarnish did not simply fade, it rapidly burned away. The ancient silver crest began to pulse with a faint, ethereal luminescence, a physical, undeniable manifestation of the magical bloodline vibrating in perfect harmony with the sovereign's aura. The glow cast a soft, warm light across Lyra's pale face, highlighting the quiet dignity that no alpha could ever strip away. Corvin looked down at the glowing heirloom in her blistered hand. The terrifying, lethal coldness in his molten silver eyes completely dissolved, replaced entirely by a profound, agonizingly gentle reverence. He saw the harsh, physical toll her survival had taken upon her body, the cracked knuckles and the pale, exhausted skin. Yet he also saw the unbreakable, forged steel of her spirit. She had survived the Whispering Woods, with nothing but a silver hairbrush and her own unbending will. The chained monarch lifted his dark head, projecting his resonant voice toward the dais, ensuring that every single cowering wolf in the territory heard the final, absolute verdict. The clink of his silver chains punctuated his decree, a heavy sound that finalized the end of Kaelin's reign. "The forgery has been burned to ash," the supreme ruler declared. He turned his massive body slightly, angling himself toward the quiet woman in grey, offering her the floor. The terrifying pressure in the room shifted, clearing a safe, protected path solely for her. "Step forward, Lyra Silverthorn. Reclaim the stones that know your name." Lyra took a breath of the freezing, ozone-laced air. The heavy, protective presence of the sovereign fell away slightly, granting her the physical space to walk her own path. She adjusted the heavy sheepskin cloak over her shoulders, her fingers gripping the glowing silver heirloom tightly in her right hand. The metal was warm against her palm, humming with a steady, ancient heartbeat that perfectly matched her own. She stepped forward. Her heavy leather boots struck the freezing flagstones with a rhythmic, measured cadence. The sound echoed loudly in the cavernous, dead silence of the hall. The cowering minor lords scrambled desperately out of her way, dragging themselves backward on their bellies to ensure they did not accidentally brush against the hem of her grey wool skirt. They parted for her like a terrified sea, their faces pressed firmly into the dirt. The woman they had banished was now walking among them as an untouchable queen. She reached the edge of the jagged crater of black ash. The magical rot had completely consumed the lower toe tips of the dais, leaving a treacherous, powdery void between the main floor and the raised platform. Lyra did not hesitate. She did not look around for a safer path. She simply lifted her boot and stepped directly into the dark, suffocating dust. She trusted the blood in her veins more than the physical obstacles before her. The instant the sole of her boot made contact with the corrupted earth, the magic powerfully reversed. The black ash did not swallow her. Instead, the powdery soot instantly crystallized, rapidly freezing into a solid, pristine bridge of pure white frost. The ice bloomed outward from her footprint in beautiful, spidery patterns, completely neutralizing the decay Sienna had caused. The land was actively, eagerly building a safe path for its true architect. The frost sparkled under the faint moonlight, a physical testament to the absolute purity of the Silverthorn line. Lyra ascended the newly formed, glittering steps of frost. She walked directly past the weeping mistress, not sparing the soot-covered woman a single downward glance. Dignity was her ultimate shield, and she absolutely refused to lower it to acknowledge a defeated usurper. Sienna was nothing to her now, just a temporary ghost who had tried on clothes that were far too heavy for her frail shoulders. As she reached the top of the dais, Kaelin lunged forward from his collapsed position on the floorboards. The broken male dragged his heavy, muscular frame across the wood, fighting fiercely against the crushing atmospheric pressure. His turbulent eyes were bloodshot, leaking tears of absolute, profound regret. The sheer desperation in his movements was pathetic, a complete contrast to the arrogant alpha who had signed the decree of erasure just weeks prior. "Lyra," the former alpha gasped, his voice a pathetic, ragged wheeze. He reached a trembling hand toward the hem of her cloak, his fingers clawing desperately at the empty air. "Lyra, please. I didn't know. I didn't see. Forgive me. I beg you, let me fix this." The exile was supposed to break her. The public erasure was designed to shatter her spine and force her into exactly this kind of pathetic, desperate begging. But Lyra did not shatter. She paused for a fraction of a second, her boots resting on the heavy timber floorboards. She looked down at the man who had legally assassinated her identity for the sake of political convenience. She saw the agonizing, hollow panic in his eyes, the absolute terror of a boy who had broken a priceless artifact, and was now desperately trying to glue the dust back together. She felt absolutely nothing. No lingering attachment, no spark of fated instinct. The energetic thread had been definitively severed at the border, and the quiet, freezing woods had burned away whatever fragile affection had remained. Her internal wolf, once bound to his presence, now sat quietly, entirely indifferent to his suffering. Lyra did not speak to him. She did not offer him a single syllable of anger, vindication, or forgiveness. She simply stepped around his trembling, outstretched hand and continued walking toward the back of the massive raised platform. Her silence was a far more devastating blow than any physical strike could ever be. It was the absolute, final confirmation of his irrelevance. Looming out of the deep, cold shadows stood the sacred stone arches. They were massive, twin portals of solid silver, deeply embedded into the very structural foundation of the keep. The intricate runic carvings on their surface matched the glowing crest on her mother's silver hairbrush perfectly. They had remained entirely cold, dormant, and lifeless since the moment she was banished, heavily tarnished by centuries of neglect and the recent toxic corruption of the false decree. The air around the sacred stone arches was impossibly heavy, waiting for the singular spark that could awaken the sleeping magic. Lyra stopped directly in front of the sacred portal. The ambient temperature around the arches was brutally cold, radiating a deep, bone-aching chill that spoke of forgotten magic and sleeping gods. She raised her right hand, holding the glowing silver heirloom delicately between her blistered fingers, and pressed her bare, calloused palm flat against the center of the massive left door. She did not push, she merely offered her touch, presenting her heritage to the stone. The physical contact was the catalyst for an ancient, catastrophic awakening, a massive concussive shockwave of pure, warm, blinding moonlight erupted from the exact point where her skin touched the metal. The sheer kinetic force of the magical blast blew backward through the hall, instantly vaporizing the remaining tendrils of grey smoke and completely shattering the heavy iron sconces on the walls. The agonizingly cold atmosphere of the keep was aggressively obliterated, replaced by a profound, sweeping wave of intense golden heat. The scent of pine and rich, fertile earth flooded the cavernous room, completely washing away the copper tang of fear. The heavy, centuries-old tarnish on the massive silver doors actively burned away, flaking off in large, dark sheets that dissolved into nothingness before they even hit the floorboards. The intricate runes carved deeply into the metal ignited, glowing with a brilliant, blinding luminescence that perfectly mirrored the molten silver eyes of the sovereign standing in the center of the hall. The magic sang through the stone, an ethereal hum that vibrated into the soles of Lyra's boots. Without a single sound of friction, the massive, impossibly heavy silver arches swung wide open. Beyond the threshold lay not a stone corridor, but a sprawling, ethereal pathway of pure, crystallized moonlight, leading deeply into the sacred, spiritual heart of the territory. The ancient magic of the land poured out of the open portal, a warm, cascading river of energy that flooded the high hall. It was a physical, radiant manifestation of the true realm, finally unveiled before the unworthy eyes of the Winter Pack. The magic washed over Lyra, recognizing the blood of the first Luna. It was a gentle, deeply restorative heat that instantly sank into her exhausted muscles, the raw, blistered skin on her palms rapidly knitted together, healing flawlessly. The biting, freezing chill that had lived in her bones since the day of her exile was permanently, completely banished. The land was crowning her, wrapping her entirely in a protective, invisible mantle of absolute authority. She stood tall in the brilliant light, a woman forged in isolation and now recognized by the gods themselves. But when the wave of ancient moonlight hit Kaelin, the magic turned vengeful. The glowing energy recognized the Alpha who had signed the fraudulent document. It recognized the man who had attempted to steal the sacred lineage. The light slammed into his muscular frame with the force of a physical hammer. Kaelan screamed, a horrifying, ragged sound of absolute biological agony. The magical backlash savagely ripped through his chest, actively searching for the alpha spark that gave him the sovereign right to rule the territory. It found the spark, and it crushed it. The heavy, aggressive alpha frequency that Kaelan had constantly weaponized to force compliance was instantly, permanently extinguished. His imposing, dominant aura collapsed entirely, shrinking inward until he was nothing more than a hollow, powerless shell. He collapsed onto the wooden floorboards, gasping for air, demoted by the ancient laws of the realm to the lowest, weakest rank of their species. He was no longer an alpha. He was nothing. The magical current stripped him of his title, leaving him as empty as the hollow vows he had broken. The glowing magic settled, illuminating the cavernous high hall in a soft, eternal silver twilight. The massive stone tomb had been transformed into a sacred sanctuary. Footsteps echoed against the floorboards. The moonlit Wolf King ascended the dais, walking smoothly over the bridge of frost Lyra had created. He bypassed the weeping, powerless former alpha and the soot-covered mistress without a single glance. Corvin approached the open, glowing arches and stopped beside the stoic woman in grey. His massive frame blocked out the rest of the ruined court, ensuring that her view was entirely filled with the ethereal light of the sacred stone arches and his towering presence. The terrifying, lethal beast was entirely gone. In his place stood a devoted protector, a man who voluntarily wore heavy metal chains to ensure she would never fear him. He looked at the brilliant, untarnished silver doors, and then he looked down at Lyra. His molten silver eyes were filled with a raw, bleeding adoration that no political decree could ever manufacture. The sheer depth of his patience was evident in the gentle tilt of his head, the way he kept his massive hands resting harmlessly at his sides. With deliberate precision, King Corvin Valerius sank to his knees on the raised timber platform. The heavy links of his restraints clattered loudly in the quiet, glowing room. Before the entire, trembling pack, before the ruined usurpers who had tried to erase her, the supreme ruler of all shifters bowed his dark head to the true Luna. It was an act of absolute, unquestionable submission from a god of war, a public declaration that his immense power existed solely to serve her, unbound by their laws, unclaimed by their petty kings, exalted by the earth itself. Lyra did not step back. She did not shrink away from the immense, terrifying power kneeling at her boots. She looked out over the quiet, glowing hall, feeling the profound, unbreakable tether connecting her soul to the sovereign at her feet. The magic of the sacred stone arches pulsed in perfect time with Corvin's heartbeat. She had survived the freezing dark, and now, bathed in the warm, restorative light of her ancestors, she would never step aside again. The ancient stones of the keep had finally remembered their architect, and the Whispering Woods had delivered her a king. Thank you for listening to this story of quiet survival, unbending dignity, and sweet absolute vindication. If you felt the cold break and the true magic awaken today, please hit that like button and subscribe to our sanctuary. Leave a comment below sharing if you would have walked away without a single tear, and join our pack so you never miss the next chapter of the wild.